Good evening, I'm Alma Angeles and you're watching Eagle News International. On tonight's headlines. U.S. President Joe Biden announced a new drive to wean Europe off Russian gas imports and so choke off the billions in revenues that are fueling Moscow's ruinous war against Ukraine. And plumes of black smoke billow from a large gray vessel docked next to big cranes following what the Ukrainian Navy said was a strike on the Russian ship. And UN global economists say the Russian invasion of Ukraine has been the main contributing factor to the potentially devastating 1% drop in projected global economic growth this year. Plus, tourists and Washingtonians flock to the capital's tidal basin to see its famed cherry blossoms after trees have reached their peak bloom. First in our news, the U.S. and EU announced a task force aimed at reducing Europe's reliance on Russian fossil fuels on the face of Moscow's war on Ukraine. The initiative being unveiled by President Joe Biden and EU chief Ursula von der Leyen will see the U.S. work with partners to strive to supply Europe with an extra 15 billion cubic meters of liquefied natural gas this year, according to the statement. And this push comes as EU member states wrangle over calls for the bloc to ban Russia's key energy exports to punish President Vladimir Putin for his invasion of Ukraine. The Baltics and Poland are urging counterparts to pull the trigger, but others, including economic powerhouse Germany, remain reluctant to impose a sudden rupture given their reliance on Russian gas imports. Germany said Friday it was drastically slashing its energy purchases from Russia amid Moscow's invasion of Ukraine, with oil imports to be halved by June and coal deliveries to end by autumn. And plumes of black smoke are billowing from this large gray vessel docked next to big cranes following what the Ukrainian Navy said was a strike on a naval ship of Russia. Ukraine says it struck this Russian naval transport vessel docked in the Azov Sea near the besieged port city of Mariupol. There was no immediate response to the claim from Russia's defense ministry, and AFP could not independently confirm the strikes. Russia's state-run TASS news agency earlier this week had described the arrival of the landing craft as an epic event that opens up opportunities for the Black Sea in terms of logistics, citing the Russian Defense Ministry-linked television channel Zvezda. TASS reported that the vessel was capable of carrying up to 1,500 tons of cargo. And Ukrainian officials in the strategic port city of Mariupol said some 300 people could have died in last week's Russian strike on a theater where hundreds were sheltering. Take a look. Citing the accounts of those who were there at the time of the blast, Mariupol City Council made the claim on Friday morning. Unfortunately, we start this day with bad news, the council said on its Telegram channel. From eyewitnesses, information appeared that about 300 people died in the drama theater of Mariupol as a result of a bombardment by a Russian aircraft. President Volodymyr Zelensky said last week, following the strike, that hundreds of people, believed mostly to be women and children, had taken in the building at the time of the attack. Mariupol, home to 450,000 before the war began, has witnessed some of the most vicious violence nationwide. Artillery has hammered a maternity hospital, flattened residential areas, and struck a theater despite signs declaring children were sheltering inside. Incoming humanitarian aid and outgoing evacuation convoys have struggled to penetrate the boundaries of the brutal siege. Mariupol is a key asset for Russia, which would complete a land bridge between the Crimean Peninsula, annexed in 2014, and the Donbas region, occupied by pro-Russia forces. Seizing the port would also deprive Ukraine of a resupply route with the outside world on its southern Black Sea coast. And U.S. President Joe Biden briefed the press after an emergency NATO summit there in Belgium. And this meeting comes exactly 1 month since the Russian invasion in Ukraine. The president said that NATO would respond if Russian President Vladimir Putin used chemical weapons in his war on Ukraine. Our correspondent from the U.S., Ken Cruz, reports from Washington.
After warning that Russian President Vladimir Putin may use biological weapons in Ukraine, President Joe Biden at an emergency NATO summit declares the U.S. will take action if there is a chemical attack.
We would respond. We would respond if he uses it. The nature of the response would depend on the nature of the use.
There's still no specifics on whether military force is on the table.
If chemical weapons were used in Ukraine, would that trigger a military response from NATO?
It would trigger a response in kind. Whether or not you're asking whether NATO would cross, we'd make that decision at the time.
The president says the summit with leaders of NATO, the G7, and the EU is sending an unmistakable message to Putin.
Putin was banking on NATO being split. My early conversation with him in December and early January was clear to me he didn't think we could sustain this cohesion. NATO has never been more united than it is today. Putin is getting exactly the opposite what he intended to have as a consequence of going into Ukraine.
President Biden and NATO again announced new penalties against Russia, including new ones on Russian lawmakers.
We're also announcing new sanctions of more than 400 individuals and entities in alignment with the European Union. More than 300 members of the Duma, oligarchs, and Russian defense companies that fuel the Russian war machine.
And $1 billion in humanitarian aid for Ukraine.
And today, I'm announcing the United States is prepared to commit more than $1 billion in humanitarian assistance to help get relief to millions of Ukrainians affected by the war in Ukraine.
But Ukraine President Volodymyr Zelensky, speaking via video in the summit, presses them to flood weapons into Ukraine. He says the West should provide all the weapons needed to prevent the deaths of Ukrainians from Russian strikes from Russian occupation. Zelensky says that Russia was using phosphorus bombs, which causes severe burns, conducting indiscriminate shelling of civilians, and could resort to full-scale use of chemical weapons. He was sharply critical to the U.S. and NATO for not doing more, saying Ukrainians are dying, and says NATO has yet to show what it can do to save people, pleading for fighter jets, tanks, and a no-fly zone. Meanwhile, President Biden says he wants to see Russia thrown out of the G20 club of leading economic nations.
Yes, that depends on the G20. That was raised today, and I raised the possibility if that can't be done, if Indonesia and others do not agree, then we should, in my view, ask to have both Ukraine be able to attend the meetings.
He also says China, which, like much of Europe, still buys Russian oil and gas, so far has not given Russia more military aid.
China understands that its economic future is much more closely tied to the West than it is to Russia. And so I'm hopeful that he does not get engaged.
The U.S. and its allies have unleashed significant sanctions against Russia for the invasion, but those penalties have not deterred Russian President Vladimir Putin. However, President Biden suggests that sanctions were not meant to deter the actions of Putin.
And I did not say that, in fact, the sanctions would deter him. Sanctions never deter. The maintenance of sanctions, the increasing the pain, and the demonstration why I asked for this NATO meeting today is to be sure that after a month we will sustain what we're doing, not just next month, the following month, but for the remainder of this entire year. That's what will stop him.
Russia's isolation on the world stage has been underscored by a second non-binding UN General Assembly resolution demanding an immediate halt to the war, which has been approved by 140 countries, with 38 abstaining and 5 voting against. Ken Cruz, Eagle News, Washington. Back to you, Alma.
Thank you, Ken. Meanwhile, the Kremlin today accused U.S. President Joe Biden of seeking to divert attention from his country's chemical and biological weapons program after he said that Russia could use such weapons in Ukraine. He said, "We see this as an attempt to divert attention to some kind of ephemeral, allegedly existing threat against the backdrop of a scandal that is flaring up in the world involving chemical and biological weapons programs that the United States has been carrying out in various countries, including Ukraine," that according to Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov. Last Friday, Russia doubled down on its claims that the U.S. and Ukraine are developing chemical or biological weapons for use against invading Russian forces, bringing the accusation to the United Nations Security Council. Meanwhile, Prime Minister Boris Johnson said Britain will send 6,000 missiles and 25 million pounds in financial aid to Ukraine's army. Now that report from Ryan Florentino. Ryan.
Prime Minister Boris Johnson said late Wednesday Britain would send 6,000 missiles and 25 million pounds, or $33 million, or 30 million euros in financial aid to Ukraine's army to help it fight Russian forces. The announcement of the funding and additional military hardware consisting of anti-tank and high-explosive weapons comes on the eve of NATO and G7 summits set to discuss the Russian invasion. The British leader will urge Western allies to step up a gear in their responses to Moscow's actions, including by providing enhanced defensive support to Ukraine and doubling down on economic sanctions. According to his office, "We cannot and will not stand by while Russia grinds Ukraine's towns and cities into dust," Johnson said in a statement. The United Kingdom will work with our allies to step up military and economic support to Ukraine, he added. The hardware has been credited as playing a key part in helping Ukraine stall Russia's invasion. The new £25 million funding will help pay the salaries of Ukraine soldiers, pilots, and police, and ensuring the country's armed forces are well equipped with high-quality equipment, Downing Street said. In addition to the new military kit and funding, Britain will also provide a £4.1 million investment for the BBC World Service as part of a cross-government effort to tackle disinformation in Russia and Ukraine, it added. And that's all reporting from the United Kingdom. I am Ryan Florentino, and we live in interesting times.
Meanwhile, the war in Ukraine has impacted global economies. In Spain, for example, prices of everything from fuel to essential supplies has gone up, and this has caused a few thousands of people to march in some 60 Spanish cities under the slogan, "Contain prices, protect jobs." The demonstrations was called by consumer associations and the two main trade unions in the country. Our correspondent from Spain, Beverly Madrid, reports from Barcelona. Bev.
Thousands of demonstrators hit the streets across Spain in protest at the soaring cost of food, light, and fuel, which have been exacerbated by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The rallies took place in Spain's main cities. They were called by the far-right Vox Party, which sought to tap into growing social discontent over the spiraling cost of living that has left many families struggling to pay their bills.
Y este gobierno es una fábrica de miseria para las familias, que ven que el diésel y la gasolina para ir a trabajar están a 2 euros, cuando hace poco estaban a 1. Que ven que la inflación está en el 7,5%, con lo que afectará a las hipotecas, con lo que está afectando a los productos de primera necesidad, que ven que la luz y el gas están en máximos históricos, antes de la guerra criminal de Putin, en la que ahora se escuda Sánchez, el tramposo y el mentiroso.
Outside City Hall in Madrid, a crowd of several thousand people gathered, waving hundreds of Spanish flags and chanting angry slogans calling for the resignation of Socialist Prime Minister Pedro Sánchez. Many said the government should be lowering taxes to help those struggling.
Ajustar los precios y una limitación que sea clara, que no permita dispararse por especulación y que las eléctricas tengan pues lo que están teniendo ahora, unos beneficios desorbitados a costa de que todas las familias y todos los trabajadores y trabajadoras de este país tengan que verse con facturas que no puedan pagar cuando llega el fin de mes.
On Monday, Spanish lorry drivers declared an open-ended strike over fuel prices. Government Minister Felix Bolaños pledged the government would unveil its planned steps to reduce the cost of energy and fuel on March 29. Sanchez is currently on a European tour to lobby for a common EU response to soaring energy prices. Madrid has for months urged its European partners to change the mechanism which couples electricity prices to the gas market. But its pleas have so far fallen on deaf ears, despite support from Paris. Reporting from Barcelona, Spain, I'm Beverly Madrid. We live in interesting times.
Meanwhile, Russia's invasion of Ukraine has been the main contributing factor to the potentially devastating 1% drop in projected global economic growth this year. That, according to the UN development economist UNCTAD, saying this on Thursday in the body's latest global economic update. This year, the world economy is forecast to grow by 2.6%, down from the rosier 3.6% forecast made last September. Let's take a look.
There is a rapidly worsening outlook for the world economy. And to think that this year, the year after 2 years of crisis with COVID-19, the average rate of growth of the world economy will be 2.6%, down from 5.5% last year and down from the projections that were made in the last quarter of 2021. We are asking for the strengthening of the measures that will help developing countries to cope with this situation. And we need emergency measures from the IMF and the World Bank. It's very important to activate the immediate funding, the rapid funding instruments that the IMF has.
Rising inflation is making matters worse for developing countries already weighed down by a $1 trillion debt burden to pay back to creditors, according to the UN body, adding that they've had insufficient support to help them withstand exchange rate instability, rising interest rates, and soaring food and fuel prices. And up next, Kim Jong-un personally oversaw the test firing of North Korea's largest ever intercontinental ballistic missile, ensuring his country is ready for long-standing confrontation with the United States. That and more when Eagle News returns.
Tama na! Puro kayo daldal! Sa dami ng problema ng mga syudad, panahon na para magbigay ng lunas!
Kailangan ng lunas sa problema ng no work, no pay. Lunas sa sweldo, sa kita, sa benepisyo. Kailangan nila ay party list sa Kongreso.
Ihanda mo ang puwersa ng Lunas Party List!
Lunas Party List, number 58 sa balota.
Hoy, Mr. Pwede! Masama at bawal ang pag-inom! Diyan ka na naman sa kakabawal mo, Mr. Bawal eh. Napaka-KJ mo. Walang magandang dulot ang pag-inom. Lalo na't eleksyon ngayon. Bawal yan!
Ayon sa Omnibus Election Code, ang pagbibenta, pagbili o pag-inom ng alak sa araw ng eleksyon ay isang election offense.
Inggit ka lang. Oh yeah, oh yeah! Pakawalan niyo ako! Hindi na ako uulit!
Hay nako. Nasa uli talaga ang pagsisisi. Don't drink and vote. Ako si Mr. Bawal na nagpapaalala na hindi na nga mabuti ang pag-inom ng alak. Tapos sa eleksyon, gagawin mo pa? Bawal yan!
A public service message of Net25 for Mata ng Halalan 2022. Matatag, matapang, matapat.
Welcome back. Kim Jong-un personally oversaw the test firing of North Korea's largest ever intercontinental ballistic missile, ensuring that his country is ready for long-standing confrontation with the U.S. That, according to state media reporting this today. The Thursday launch was the first time Pyongyang has fired Kim's most powerful missiles at full range since 2017. And it appears to have traveled higher and further than any previous ICBM tested by the nuclear-armed country, including one designed to strike anywhere on the U.S. mainland. State media photographs showed Kim wearing his customary black leather jacket, dark sunglasses, striding across the tarmac in front of a huge missile, with other images of him cheering and celebrating the test launch with uniformed military top brass. The new ICBM would make the whole world clearly aware of the power of our strategic armed forces once again, Kim said, according to the KCNA, adding that the country was now fully ready for long-standing confrontation with the U.S. imperialists, unquote. The United States imposed new sanctions on entities and people in Russia and North Korea after Pyongyang's latest ICBM missile test. The targeted persons and organizations are accused of transferring sensitive items to North Korea's missile program, according to a State Department statement. These measures, it said, are part of our ongoing efforts to impede the DPRK's ability to advance its missile program, and they highlight the negative role Russia plays on the world stage as a proliferator to programs of concern, the statement said, using the official acronym for North Korea. The new sanctions were quickly derided by Moscow's ambassador in Washington, named Anatoly Antonov, who said that serial sanctions will not achieve their goals. In other news, to the U.S. now, where the city of Miami Beach imposed a midnight curfew to stem a wave of violence it has linked to spring break, according to a U.S. college tradition which seeks an influx of party-goers into Florida every year. The decision came after two shootings that left 5 people wounded in recent days in Miami Beach. Let's listen in.
Our city is well past its endpoint. What we're watching and what we're feeling and what we're observing is simply unacceptable at every level. So today, in a few moments, you're going to hear from our city manager, who's going to announce signing of an executive order that's going to implement a curfew, a midnight curfew, beginning Wednesday night, Thursday morning at 12:01, going through the weekend. You know, last 2 nights, 5 innocent people were shot in our streets. And that's despite the fact that we had one of the most massive deployments of police resources our city really has seen. I think we had 371 police officers operational in South Beach. You know, we can't endure this anymore. We just simply can't.
We were at first kind of nervous to leave the hotel because we were reading lots of things, but there are cops stationed everywhere. They have certain roadblocks off, and I just feel like I've seen business owners reach out to a cop if they are seeing something. So, and we're from small town Wisconsin, and we feel okay walking around and everything.
The police everywhere and police incidents, and they were arresting people, and yeah, so A little bit of a shock.
On Wednesday, City Hall announced it was adding a ban on alcohol sales in liquor stores and supermarkets in the busiest parts of town from 6 p.m. until opening time the next day, and these curbs do not extend to bars and restaurants. Last year, police also imposed a curfew after arresting more than 1,000 people over the course of 6 weeks for street fights and vandalism. To avoid a repetition this year, authorities have increased police presence in the busiest areas and banned bars from selling alcohol after 2 a.m. Rules that will be in place from March 7 to the 21st. Every year in the spring, hordes of partygoers take over the Miami Beach waterfront for late-night drinking parties that can quickly turn ugly. Briefing reporters in Geneva, WHO Director General Tedros Ghebreyesus said the global increase in cases continues.
The global increase in COVID-19 cases continues, driven by large outbreaks in Asia and a fresh wave in Europe. Several countries are now seeing their highest death rates since the beginning of the pandemic. This reflects the speed with which Omicron spreads and the heightened risk of death for those who are not vaccinated, especially older people.
Omicron is a highly transmissible variant of concern. BA.2 is more transmissible than BA.1. And what we are starting to see in some regions of the world, in some countries, an uptick in cases again. This is in the context of Omicron, which is highly transmissible, but also in the context of lifting of public health and social measures. So whatever variant is circulating, if you lift all of the public health measures that we know can reduce the spread of this virus, the virus will take advantage of that.
The reproductive number has risen above 1 in many countries. So in effect, transmission has taken off again in many countries. But what we've seen in those countries that have high levels of vaccination, especially amongst vulnerable people, is that continued decoupling of that high incidence from pressure on the health system and high rates of hospital admission and high rates of death. So what we see is countries coping with that opening up. And as Maria said, when you open up as quickly as some countries have, you will get that bounce in transmission. If you add to that the increased transmissibility of BA.2, then you get a double impact, a double effect. Other variants may emerge. This will, and with other effects like season and temperature, we may see incidents vary greatly around the world in the coming months. But I think the message we can take from this is, in all of those countries that have focused on vaccination, have focused on vaccinating their most vulnerable and protecting the most vulnerable population, it does not necessarily result in massive increases in pressure in the health system, and it doesn't result in increases in death rates. What we've learned so far with each and every one of the variants that's come along, that good surveillance, good tracking linked to measures that reduce transmission, but importantly, measures that protect individuals, especially vaccination, lead to a situation where the health system can cope and populations can continue to live their lives as normally as possible.
And finally in our news, tourists and Washingtonians are flocking to the capital's tidal basin to see its famed cherry blossoms after trees have reached peak bloom. Estela Dominique from our Washington, D.C. Bureau reports.
Under a pink sky, a cherry blossom sky that is. These beautiful trees have hit their peak bloom this year, and thousands of spectators couldn't wait to take a snapshot of the wonder.
Here in D.C., the National Cherry Blossom Festival has begun, evident with these exquisite blooms of the cherry blossom trees. These lovely pink wonders are a display of friendship between the United States and Japan. This year marks the 110th anniversary of Japan gifting the nation's capital thousands of cherry blossom trees. Surrounded with such a wonder, although they give out the tiniest hint of a scent, the mere sight of this lovely landscape amid the nation's capital already possesses a priceless fragrance of its own.
Hurry and schedule a quick trip to the tidal basin if you still want to catch a glimpse of this spring celebration. Estella Dominique, Eagle News, Washington, D.C.
Beautiful. Thank you, Estella. And as always, I'll end the day on a thoughtful note. Our ability to look back and smile at our past is proof that God's plan is to keep us moving forward. This has been Eagle News International. I'm Alma Angeles. Stay alert, stay informed, because we live in interesting times. Good night.
Ang susunod na programa ay rated PG. Ito ay nangangailangan ng patnubay at gabay ng magulang para sa mga batang manonood.